Hi, my name is Nicole Golden, and I'm the host of the Mental Health Matters podcast. Today I'm talking with Megan Richardson, who is a licensed mental health professional, about the importance of setting up boundaries. And I know sometimes boundaries can sound super triggering, but she has so many great things to say about how loving and safe boundaries can actually be. As you're watching or listening, if you like what you hear and you want to share it, that would be great, or you can subscribe by hitting the button below. But either way, I'm super glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's hop into the podcast. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Golden, and I am joined with Megan Richardson. What I love about Megan is she is one of my personal friends, but then also been a trusted therapist that I've referred a number of people to. So, Megan, real quickly, can you just tell us a little bit about your credentials, and then also what got you into the whole business of counseling, therapy, all of that jazz?
So to not make that a long answer, the short answer is, in a lot of ways, my mom is someone that I really respect and adore, and she is a therapist. So she's had a private practice, and I grew up watching her both help others, but also feel like her profession really informed who she was as a mom and a parent. And I always felt like safest to be myself with her and wanted to be able to give that gift to other people, ultimately. And so my interest, the other cue was like in college, I remember like cuddling up in Starbucks reading psych books and like really loving it. So like I had other majors that I was trying out and I was not doing the same. So that was also kind of a cue to kind of go in the direction of where I had interest.
Yeah.
So I'm currently a licensed marriage and family therapist. Most of my referrals are for couples. I love supporting relationships, normalizing the challenges that we are all kind of experiencing and going through, a bit out of a selfish interest and wanting, my own relationships with others to be, as healthy as possible. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I currently have a private practice that is only offering virtual sessions at this time. And hopefully
I love that. I love that. And just a quick plug for virtual sessions, that's what I do currently with my therapist who I've been with for 14 years. It just takes so much of the extra periphery excuses out of the way, because it's like you don't have to worry about driving, sitters, all of that other stuff. You're in and out in that set amount of time. And so I know some people get a little nervous about virtual sessions, but I've found it's made therapy and going to therapy even easier for me, honestly. And you can still get that connection with the therapist virtually. So just a quick little plug. All right, Megan, we are going to talk about you are going to help people who are walking through a mental health diagnosis or mental health concerns. You are going to help people figure out how to walk through that with someone in relationship. So, for instance, just to give everybody a little bit of background, when I was diagnosed with 3 different mental health diagnoses, which was so fun for Bryant, right after we got married, he had a major learning curve of figuring out, okay, I have no personal connection with mental health issues. He's never had a diagnosis. He's never really struggled with anxiety or depression or any of those things. And so he had this huge learning curve of like, okay, how do I walk with someone now who is walking through these diagnoses, who's having all of these changes, who's having to come to grips with all of this? How do I walk through that? And so there's going to be married people who are going to be watching this. There's going to be people who are not married watching this. There's going to be brothers and sisters watching this. I had to walk through this with my brother Eric of what boundaries do I put in place, all of those things. So the first question I wanted to ask you is this, because we get asked this quite often. Should a person cut and run from a relationship when they find out that the person they are in relationship with, whether it's marriage, friendship, sibling, whatever, is suddenly diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, or all of a sudden is having, like in my case, a nervous breakdown out of nowhere? Should they cut and run? Should they stay? Are there different levels of cutting and running? Like they're friends, so you can cut and run as a friend, but not as a, when do you cut and run? Do you ever cut and run? How would you answer that question? Good luck.
So, I have a few things that come to mind, even in the wording of your question too. So I'll try to keep this organized in my thoughts. Yes. Of course, you would probably not be surprised to hear me say, no, the simple answer is not to cut and run when someone's been diagnosed or when you're in a close relationship with someone who's managing either a recent diagnosis or, struggling with mental health concerns. A lot of times our mental health concerns can also be a source of our greatest strength. There's a lot of beauty in our differences. So just because it's maybe something that we don't understand doesn't mean it's something to necessarily shy away from or run away from, but actually maybe to move closer. So the Gottmans often talk about how when there's tension in relationships, they see they had a new book come out that kind of discusses that anger is actually an approach emotion. It's kind of calling people to get closer, that there's some misunderstanding in terms of unmet needs. And so if there's even frustration in relationships, which is predictable, it's kind of how do we view that? Where's the opportunity here? For learning, for understanding, for getting curious.
Yeah.
So a lot of times with relationships, what I talk about with clients is to first kind of gauge the relationship on a spectrum of trust. So it's not I either trust you or I don't. It's where do you fall on that spectrum? So trust, essentially meaning, do I believe that you have my best interest in mind? It's essentially what we're kind of looking for. So where someone falls on that spectrum might be based on a lot of different things. What has been my experience with you so far? Are you willing to take responsibility when there's been kind of a rupture in the relationship? Are you open to feedback or self-awareness? Are you curious about me and my perspectives and my opinions? And so it can fall on so many different, parts of the spectrum first before just, cutting off. Because I know lately it seems safe, right? A lot of people you hear say oh, that relationship is toxic. I'm just going to cut off that relationship is toxic. And I really believe, well, sometimes that can be true, especially if safety is a concern, whether it's marriage or, a friendship even. The answer would always be yes, cut and run in a scenario like that. But if not, if we just are having kind of anger or conflict, we could be missing out on an opportunity for closeness or an opportunity for this person in your life to really shine through more of a boundary limit setting kind of conversation. It gives and grants kind of the opportunity for the relationship to grow, through kind of that mutual understanding.
Yeah. Gosh, I love that you said that anger is an approach emotion. That is my mind just exploded. I think it's so interesting, especially for people like me who have a mental health diagnosis. We weren't asking for that, right? We weren't looking for that. It's not like we started out in our life boy, I really hope I get a mental health diagnosis.
This, please.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of times they come out of nowhere or they come out of trauma experiences or whatever. And I think in that initial diagnosis, there's this grappling with, who am I? What's the rest of my life going to look like? And for me, at least, I had enough self-awareness to know that for Bryant, this was going to be a learning curve for him. This was going to be very difficult for him. This was going to be a thing that we were going to either, learn to tackle together or, our marriage was going to end and I was going to have to figure it out on my own. And that scared me to death, literally, because I tell Bryant all the time, had you left me, had you divorced me, had you whatever, I don't think I'd be alive today. I really don't. And that's humbling to say. That's, really difficult to say. But I think in that situation, if you're walking through this with somebody else, giving them the grace to realize they didn't choose this, they didn't ask for this, they are broken about how they're hurting themselves, how they're hurting you. And I think, yes, that was what kind of my next question is, figuring out then how to appropriately and healthily set up boundaries so that you both can seek health, right? And so that you both can be healthy. So that was my next question is, maybe give some examples of appropriate boundaries, because to be honest, if you are walking in relationship with someone who is going through an initial mental health diagnosis or who is struggling with mental health issues, the relationship can get toxic, just because that person can go in and out of health and unhealth, right? I have seasons where I'm healthier than others. And so there are going to be seasons where you might need more boundaries than. So what are some appropriate boundaries maybe people can put into place? And then how are boundaries considered loving? Because sometimes when we hear boundaries, we get repulsed by it and like almost embarrassed. Like, you need a boundary with me, you know, like you think I'm that unsafe or whatever. So what are some good appropriate boundaries? And then how can boundaries be? And is there another word maybe that you use in your practice instead of boundaries? Because that can be a trigger word.
You're bringing up so many great points. So my mind already starts to swirl. And I think that I first want to acknowledge, you know, in the experience that you experienced with Bryant, especially early on as you were grappling with your diagnosis, there was this gift that he gave you, which was to walk through that with you. And with that, the assumption is he had to likely learn how to boundary himself so that he could essentially show up for you and stay with you and support you ultimately so that you both, you know, can grow in that ultimately. And so boundaries in a lot of ways can really be a gift. Although, like you said, boundaries are not usually us using the language of, okay, Nicole, it's time for me to set up a boundary with you. You know, it's you on the defenses a lot. So a lot of my thoughts, I always like to give credit. So a lot of the boundary language that I use comes from like Brene Brown, who I know you guys have mentioned before.
Love Brene.
So a lot of her research, her books, Melissa Urban also talks a lot about boundaries as well. And what Brene Brown talks about is in her research, the most compassionate people, she said, were also the most boundaried, which I thought was like really fascinating. So as she studied like nuns and just people who really focused on like spiritual compassion and things like that. And so what she would say is that boundaries are actually a prerequisite for compassion, which ultimately is what we're trying to give and offer to someone who is either recently diagnosed or walking through something like depression or anxiety or grief even. And so it kind of becomes, how do we define what boundary is, right? And so few key terms would be like, boundaries is where I end, where you begin. You know, where can we meet? We're two different people. And so if this is as far as I can go, this is where you can meet me, you know, or if that feels like it's getting pushed against, and maybe that wouldn't work. Boundaries can also be seen as like what's okay and what's not okay. It's conveying a message of what works for me, what doesn't, kind of thing. And so boundaries doesn't actually mean putting a wall up, you know, it actually opens the door, right? It's saying like, this is how we can be in relationship. This is, you know, it's creating this opportunity for relationship. The other phrase that Brené's famous for kind of saying is like, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me at the same time. So it's really this idea of honoring self and other at the same time. So it's not all you or all me. It's kind of how do we both fit here ultimately. So the other piece I like to add with boundaries is a lot of times we think with boundaries that it's what's okay and not okay with you, you know? So it's not about control and telling someone what they can and can't do. It's much more about the I, what I'm willing to give, what I'm willing to do, how far I'm willing to go. So it's kind of more like limit setting. So like an idea being like, if your friend's, you know, asking you to dinner in the evening, you might say something like, well, the evenings are tough. Responsibility is really high. Saying goodbye to my kids is torturous. Like, you know, weekends are much easier for me, you know, lunch or breakfast during the week. That would really work for me. And so that's not a harsh boundary. It's just saying, this is how I can show up for you with the best version of myself, where I'm not feeling like resentment or frustration or that this is really stressful. So, you know, this is where like boundaries can actually help me to be more generous, right? This is when I can give you more of me. This is when I can assume the best, you know, in the people around me. And so with boundaries, the idea is that clear is kind is the other thing that Brene Brown says, that the more clear you can be in your relationships about how far, you know, you're willing to go, that is what's ultimately kind, right? Otherwise people are left with like, why is she saying no? Or why, you know, why is she saying less? And so when I can be clear, it builds trust too, right? You can trust that my yes is a true yes. You know, when I say I'm available at 10:30, I'm available at 10:30, and you can trust that. If I say no, you can trust that, you know, we'll find another time or whatever that would mean. So I have a few more thoughts, but do you want me to pause?
No, I want you to keep going because this is so good. I think this is some of the clearest language I've heard about boundaries. And I'll just throw this in there real quick. Is like, I love what you said about, you know, I think that was one thing that I had to learn with my brother Eric when he was going through his opioid addiction and in rehab and then coming out and struggling again. And, you know, my therapist, Kevin, told me to put boundaries. It felt very unloving. It feels very, very unloving. It feels selfish. But one of the things that he explained to me, which is what you were saying is like, I wasn't just his sister, but I'm also Brian's wife. I was my kid's mother. I had friends. And if I'm giving everything to Eric, then there's nothing left to give to anybody else. And then there's also nothing left to give to myself. So I love, and then you're exactly right with then it starts to build resentment and anger. And then you're short with the people that you love. And so now you're resentful of yourself. And so boundaries protects everybody involved, really. It keeps you from getting resentful of that person, at yourself, all those things. So anyways, I just wanted to piggyback on that. Yes, continue. What were your other thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, with what you're saying too, it in some ways it's a risk, but boundaries creates an opportunity for growth, even in the other person, right? Like, with Eric, there probably was this, like, I hope that you somehow get this or understand. Yeah. And when I keep moving in the relationship, like everything is okay when it's not giving the message of this either isn't working for me or that this isn't okay. And so it can be, that wouldn't be the why, but it can be an impetus for change for someone else. And there's always risk there, right? Because to be in a relationship, there's choice on both sides. Yes. So if I say to you, this is as far as I can go, this is how I can show up, and that doesn't work for the other person, and they then cut and run, that can be incredibly painful. That can feel like rejection. And that can make you question why, right? Like, did I do the right thing? And
did I give enough of myself? Did I hold back?
Yeah. And that's what makes boundaries very hard to grapple with, right? Because it's not always super clear, because of course you care and of course you want to help, and not kind of to the detriment of yourself, ultimately.
Yeah.
So you can be thinking too. So
yeah, no, I love it. Think away. Do you want me to ask you another question?
Now, I think that, the other point that I want to make, I was wondering if this is a shift or if I could create a bridge to that. But I think the other just point I want to make too is if you think about with boundaries, when other people set boundaries with you, it tends to be okay. So I like to say this just to be a bit permission giving. Like if someone says I can't tonight or that doesn't work for me, we tend to be pretty responsive and respectful to that.
Yeah.
And so to use that as permission giving for ourselves, that, in safe relationships, that is a part of being in relationship with each other, respecting that. And so to feel safe enough to offer that is just really reasonable. So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing is boundaries allow you to create safe relationships, right? And it's exactly what you said. You can create boundaries, you can have safe relationships when you've built that trust. And I think even building that trust is contingent on building the boundaries, so that there isn't any hidden resentment or, and so much of that comes just from clear communication. And I don't think you necessarily have to use the language of hey, I'm going to set this boundary with you right now. But just, I like what you said, hey, I can't do that, but I can do this, clearly creating those. So let's move on. This question is going to make me emotional. So I'm going to try. But I remember, it's so funny how vividly I remember this. A couple months before Eric passed, I remember sitting on Kevin's couch in his office, and he was telling me to set up boundaries. Cause Eric had 24/7 access to me at that point. I had allowed that. And he would call and take out all his anger. He would call and make all these threats. He would call, not on me, but on his own life. And it wasn't a good place. And so Kevin really encouraged me to set up some boundaries for myself. And I remember saying to him, if I do this and then he takes his life, or this ends badly, or over whatever the case may be, what then? And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he was like, what then? And he made me answer the question. And I was like, it wouldn't be my fault. And I said it like a question. He was like, say it again, but not as a question, And I think that to this day, I still struggle with, maybe I should have done more, maybe I could have done more. But I also know that those boundaries were necessary for my own health, for my kids' health. So can we talk through that tension of, what does happen then if the other person doesn't respect the boundaries, if the other person decides, no, I don't want to be in this relationship with you, or if the other person ends up hurting themselves or whatever the case, how do we manage that tension of, did I do something wrong? Could have I done more?
Mm-hmm. it's such a question that is like part of the human experience, right?
Mm.
So like you're not alone in that. Grief leads to questions like that. Could I have done something more? So in a lot of ways, that's just really a normal grief response. And I think what that question represents is how sometimes boundaries are just not clear, you know? As I was thinking through what we were going to talk about today, I was talking to my mom and I was like, you know, how do I talk about the fact, you know, of like, you know, because Brian, you know, often says, what does love demand of me? You know, and how can that be informed with boundaries? Okay, boundaries can be loving. And then even recently, like the humility sermon, I'm like, so some of the spaces where I have boundaries, I'm like, where am I okay or am I not? You know, and so it's this real grappling with like, what does love demand of me? What, you know, is called, what am I called to as a Christ follower? And really like weighing that balance of how much I love and care about these people, how much I want change to happen, and maintaining myself. And I think that is the dilemma, is that sometimes it's just not clear, you know, you want it to be in terms of what are those limits. And the answer that I can come up with that so far with what we know, you know, is that, that one of the beautiful parts about boundaries is that they're flexible, right? So it's with what we know now, how can we act in the best way, both honor you and me, you know? So it is a way to manage that guilt, because, you know, we couldn't have predicted the future.
That's
You've always wanted, you know, health for Eric. And you've tried to offer that in every way possible, ultimately, to try and see and stick, you know, what lands, what doesn't. And, you know, then ultimately, where is the responsibility?
Isn't that funny? That's so true. Is like, what do we know now in this moment? Because I do think sometimes when we walk through a season of grief, and it could be grief from losing someone, it could be grief from losing an ideal of something. You know, maybe the relationship doesn't look the way you thought it was going to look. Maybe the person is different than who you thought they were going to be. So grief comes in all shapes and sizes, right? Even grief for your own life. Like, I didn't see my life headed this way, you know? But grief is so mean because when you are in the middle of grief and you look back, you got a lot of clarity about how things could have gone, should have gone, would have gone, because now you're at the other end of it, right? And so I think I love what you're saying about what are the best decisions in this moment, in the present moment I'm in. What are the best decisions for their health, my health, the other people that I love, their health? I love that, of just being in the present moment, being in the now, not trying to think of the what ifs. And then once, you know, you're past that moment of when the boundaries were necessary, not thinking of the if onlys, you know. I think really being in that present moment.
And you bring up, you know, another great point, which is, you know, there has to be permission to grieve when there are boundaries in place, right? You know, so there's, I think it's Brene Brown who talks about like lowercase grieving and uppercase grieving. For you, there was likely a lot of grieving even before, you know, Eric died, ultimately, where, like you talked about, it's the dream of the relationship, what I envisioned for us, you know, what I remember about what we used to be and what things were like.
And
there are so many losses, you know, around like what I want for my kids and this relationship with this person. And so there can be a lot of tension around the loss. And sometimes we can misconstrue that for, have I done something wrong, versus I just feel bad.
Wow.
I feel bad and this is hard, right? Where I can both feel at peace with the decision and realize like, this is difficult, but then what's the alternative, you know, in terms of what that would have meant at the same
I just
time.
want to repeat that again in case someone missed it. There is, that's so true. The lines between have I done something wrong and I just have grief, or I just feel bad about how, those lines get blended and blurred. So I think sometimes, yes, we're experiencing actual grief about the situation, but we're misinterpreting it as, oh, I did something wrong, when it's just, wow, Megan, that's like, you're blowing my mind here. I feel like I'm like having my own little personal therapy session. That is so good. That's so good.
It's a lot of preaching to the choir too, right? Because I mean, that loss feeling is very real, you know, and someone like a brother, you know, or a friend, I mean, like, to try to set boundaries into that lead to, you know, any kind of loss is painful, you know, and so that's where it feels murky. And that's where there can be guilt, fear, you know, and questioning, you know, of all of that.
Well, and I think that's why, so we have like 3 minutes left. So I just want to, I think that's why it's so important that if you are walking in relationship with someone who is struggling with a mental health crisis, diagnosis, concern, whatever the case may be, I think it is so important for you yourself to be in counseling. So I remember with Bryant and I was in therapy twice a week in the beginning because I was, Kevin's like, once a week is not enough for you. So once a week for me. And then the other one was Bryant and I together, to where Bryant could kind of observe the counseling situation and then also ask questions, or as things were brought up, ask, how can I help? What can I do? That sort of thing. So, all right. So in like 2 minutes, best piece of advice you would give someone who's in a relationship with someone who is walking through a mental health diagnosis, crisis, concern, whatever the case may be.
So I have a few, but my first piece of advice would be to ask them. So instead of assuming what they need to, a lot of times in our community group, we use the language of like, what does support look like for you today or even right now? Because boundaries are flexible. Support for what your, partner or friend might look like today might be different. They might want to talk about it one day and cocoon the next, and so ask first instead of assuming that what's best for them ultimately. To also do your research, if you know that someone you love is struggling with grief, depression, anxiety, or anything else, we don't always want to be the teachers, especially when we're making our own meaning of what's happening and are uncertain and scared. And so when we now feel responsible for teaching the people that we love, that adds a layer of just stress and overwhelm that becomes very difficult. And so to bring understanding to the table can be such a gift without that person having to be a teacher ultimately. I would also add to take the expectation away from fixing anything, So I think Brene Brown, who I'm mentioning a lot, talks a lot about sitting in the dark with someone, both figuratively, but also maybe literally, that we don't necessarily want to take on someone's feelings and feel for, but just kind of feel with, walk alongside. And we're so not used to that, especially as Americans. Like, we want the quick fixes, right? We want to make it better. We want you to be happy. And that comes from a good place. And when I'm trying to create a fix, it can be very dismissive to what is true, where have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Usually that person probably has. They don't need new ideas. They just need someone to sit kind of in that intolerable pain with them. And that Sue Johnson is the one that says, like, that's kind of the greatest gift you can give someone, is to sit with them in their pain and not try to fix, and to sit in that discomfort, because it's very difficult. Yes. That's a lot of what therapy is, as too. It's comfort with the discomfort of sitting in that pain. So I have one other thought.
Share. You have time.
With boundaries is, I would say, to focus more on the what's okay versus the what's not okay when you're trying to set that limit with somebody. So you can use that language of like, it's really best for me if, or like, it would really help me if, and using that positive type language can be just a really simple tool of conveying your needs and finding yourself, to be more assertive in some of those scenarios. That was the other thought.
I love that. I love ending on that little practical note. So Megan, thank you so much. This was incredible. I'm so excited for people to hear this and interact with this, because I think some of your little nuggets that you shared are just amazing. And she mentioned the author Brene Brown throughout the interview. Brene Brown is one of my favorites. So that's definitely a resource that you guys could look up and get any one of her books. She's phenomenal. So Megan, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I believe we will be linking Megan's information and stuff on our resource page. So if you're in the market for a therapist, Megan is one of my favorites. You can trust her. And we're just so grateful for you, Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I appreciate you.